This is John McAuliff, and I am the director of the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. If you look, I'm going to say a little procedurally, and if you look in the chat, you'll see the intended order of speakers. One of our speakers, Ed Augustin, is having trouble connecting. So I'm going to continue to try to solve that problem. And we obviously will not have him as the first speaker. Instead, we will ask Rafael Hernandez to start us off. Just two mechanical things. We'll keep the chat closed until we get to the discussion portion of the program and through the Q&A. And at that point, you can contact other people. There should be, somebody's saying they're not seeing the speakers. I'll have to look at that one too. But in any case, it's on the list, the blog page. So if you have a question, you can post it in the Q&A, and please use that for questions. If you have comments or you want to reach out to other people to tell them about something you're doing, or just to contact an old friend. Well, if it's an old friend, use the private chat, not the general chat. But if you want everybody to know it, you can use the general chat. And as I say, we will open that in the discussion. So Rafael Hernandez, as you've seen in the bios that are on the blog page, okay, is the creator, the editor of the journal Temas, which also has a web page and creates events in Havana on the last Thursday of every month, should you be there. And it's, I assume that's starting again post-COVID, maybe. If it hasn't, Rafael will tell us. But the intention of this is to both share information and to get as much feedback and comment as possible from you. I made a decision to go to Cuba. Whoops, we just lost Rafael. That's not encouraging. Okay. Okay, this is the great joy of doing Zooms with Cuba. Rita is still on, so we may further change the order.
Yesterday, if it had been yesterday, I wouldn't be on either. There was no signal all day long where I am.
Okay, the overall Zoom problem is a US artifact. It's not possible for normal Zoom sign-ins from Cuba. You have to go through a VPN because of US regulations. Why those regulations exist is completely beyond me. It's not even that people have to pay to subscribe. So it just is one of those artifacts from the Trump years that have unfortunately continued in the Obama period. So why don't I know there are a lot of travel advisors and tour operators on the call. Rita, if you don't mind, if you could give people some orientation about what's happening now on travel and what you expect to happen. Rita is the head of a travel program that's located in Havana, almost unique in doing that. So I'll let her explain more about what she does and give you a sense of exactly what the travel situation is, and see if I can figure out what's going on in the meantime. Rita, go ahead.
So I'm sure you all know that November 15th, we officially opened to tourism. As I've been in Cuba throughout the pandemic, and left for a short while and came back on the 3rd of November after a few weeks visiting family. But things as far as, I was a little apprehensive about how things would be, what would be available for tourists starting in November. I actually have some peak clients down here right now that come down for the cigar festival every year. And there's kind of some cigar stuff happening at the moment. So there are some people in town. They are having a fantastic time. Shockingly enough, Havana has done a really good job of making things available for the opening. So from arrival in the airport, it was very smooth for them. The casas that that I've been using for a long time, they're all open again, and they're pretty well stocked. The paladars are, some of the paladars you can't even get into, they're so busy. So there is a lot of nightlife options, a lot of restaurant options open right now. In the past week, I've been to 3 concerts that had an incredible audience, that were really just fantastic shows. The Tropicana reopened, so there is a lot available. As far as nightlife, as far as restaurants, activities. I am starting to see, which we've seen for a couple of weeks now, groups coming through from Veradero on day trips, and visiting the main sites, the museums, and kind of, so there is a lot of life kind of coming back finally to Old Havana and to the downtown areas. You are starting to see tourists, not Americans at the moment. There are, people coming in from Europe and from Russia for the most part. And that's really been, and in large part due to the crazy expensive flights from the US that we're seeing really through January at the moment. I'm seeing someone is asking about when flights will be added. They were promised to be adding 400 additional flights to the country from the entire world, 70 weekly from the US. JetBlue did add some flights last week, but across the board, there's still a very limited offering from the US. The prices really aren't going down until mid to late January as of right now. But I do know that some of the airlines do plan on adding in the next couple of weeks. Another question that I've been getting a lot about is the vaccination rates. Cuba's done a fantastic job with the vaccination rates. We're at about 81% of the population vaccinated, fully vaccinated, and that's above 2 years old. So it is a very safe place to be coming to as far as COVID, as regarding COVID right now. The daily rates of COVID infection are somewhere around 200 to 300 cases per day, and we haven't had a death in a couple of days, I believe. So the country's done a fantastic job with COVID, and they're the only country in the world that I believe is vaccinating children over 2, as young as 2 years old. So they're still using masks in the street, but it does feel like a very safe place to be traveling. You're not endangering anyone. You're not really endangering anyone here by bringing in something from the plane or whatnot, because everyone is vaccinated. I myself have received Abdala, and I actually, I received the 3 doses of Abdala in July, and I had been staying with somebody who got COVID. And I know it's always a case-by-case basis, but I never got COVID. Tested negative 3 times after having received that vaccine. There will be, as of November 15th, as long as you are fully vaccinated with a WHO recognized vaccine, you can travel to Cuba pretty freely. And that's kind of it. I'm open to any questions if anyone has any specific questions. I'm seeing a lot of questions about food in the forum, but like I said, the paladars are very well stocked. Any of the casas, any of the hotels are well recognized and kind of that have an established clientele. They all seem to be doing pretty well with the food situation. the prices have gone up quite a bit. And the other thing that has changed in the last year and a half, obviously, is the currency. So we are working on moneda nacional, whereas in the past, everyone was using CUC. And the exchange rates are a little bit more favorable now, although you can no longer bring US dollars to Cuba to change officially. So you're needing to travel with cash always from the US as always. And your change rates are, so basically the equivalent of $1 previously would be about 24 CUP now. And the prices have gone up so much that it will be shocking for people who have not been here in a while. I was at a bar last night and one beer is 250 Cuban pesos, which would be the equivalent of about $10 previously. So the prices have gone up quite a bit. And again, you can only exchange with euros and euros, Canadian dollars, basically any other currency except for the USD.
One thing that should be said is that the street rate on the CUP is about 3 times what the official rate is, which means in real terms, prices are not abnormal. In other words, your beer would cost you $3 rather than $10. Our hope is that Cuba will find a way, as other countries have, which have a big disparity between the official rate and the street rate, to bring the official rate closer to the street rate. I'm not enough of an economist to know what the costs to them are of doing that, but it obviously is going to. Andrea Holbrook said that she had heard from American Airlines that the problem is later, that after January, that Cuba has not yet approved the additional flights. Have you heard anything about that, Rita?
I haven't heard that, and that can always be kind of confusing because the airlines always say one thing and then the Cuba is saying another thing. They were supposed to be added the week of the 15th, or at least start to be added. I know that JetBlue did definitely add, because I saw the flights that were added. There were flights to New York added, and I don't know about American Airlines though.
Okay. All right, there are a lot of specific questions and we will come back to them at the end. Rafael, you're back now with us, and we still don't have Ed. So if you're ready to go ahead, then we will hope in the meantime that Ed will be able to join us. So you need to unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself first. There you go. Oops. There.
You hear me?
Yes, now we do. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. This is what I would like to write about for my next little article. I am going to share these ideas with you, and then I can have your feedback. How to develop confidence-building measures with the Cuban government. That's my subject. The premises. Well, you know what are the premises. How do Cuban politicians view the relationship with the United States? The conflict with the United States has left a footprint on the mentality of Cuban politicians, both historically and currently. The main one is the besieged fortress syndrome. This syndrome is not just paranoia, because the US continues to try to change the regime. The accumulated political result has a worse effect than the embargo, and that is the legacy of mistrust. That to me is the real problem, the hardest problem to fight and to overcome. The legacy of mistrust does not differentiate from the viewpoint of the Cuban government, does not differentiate between very conservative and very liberal American politicians, because both sides have followed the pattern of regime change historically. Today, the Cuban government doesn't seem to expect the US to use military means, but there is nothing that guarantees neither a treaty nor an agreement within the framework of the United Nations, nor a guarantor capable of preventing any US president from doing so. So you can, if you happen to have Donald Trump again, that is not good for that those building measures, confidence building measures. Nor is there any mechanism that prevents US intervention in Cuban internal politics or in the destabilization of the political system, the public order, the citizen security. And we have a big national security apparatus as a consequence of that. As a consequence of the challenge the United States represents for Cuba. And that device, that apparatus absorbs resources that could be used for other purposes, but above all, it has a bearing on national politics, particularly in everything related to the US as a domestic factor. In other words, for internal opposition and for relations with exiles. Well, the real bottom line of Cuban policy vis-a-vis the United States, as you know perfectly well, are no double standard, no preconditions. That's it. There's no, from my viewpoint, there's no ideological limitations like these two ones. The main precondition used by the United States has been the change of the political and economic system. The main double standard has been to accuse Cuba of human rights violations, using a yardstick that the United States does not apply to any of its powers. Well, these policies are perceived by the government and by many Cubans as immoral, since the limitations on basic freedom in Cuba have been fueled by the US policy of force. These policies have paved the way for all those who, in the Cuban government, this is the perfect justification for all those who, within the Cuban government, in the ranks of the party and in the Cuban society, are suspicious or opposed to dialogue and negotiation with the United States, because they believe that that expectation of change with the United States are completely useless. Not just in the Communist Party, but in the streets. People in the streets that I know, ordinary Cubans that I know, believe that this is useless. They have also facilitated the idea that exposing itself to a negotiating process with the United States is more dangerous for Cuba than anything else, since it exposes Cuba to having to agree to political demands and concessions with unpredictable results. This is the rationale for a conservative line that is not supporting the rapprochement. Well, what could be 7 actions that could facilitate the progress and achievement of confidence-building measures? Number 1. Well, first of all, paradoxically, the military and the businessmen on both sides have made more progress and set more examples of mutual understanding than professional politicians. What lessons we could learn from this understanding for the rapprochement between public sector institutions and civil society on both sides? Number one, avoid any link between progress in relations and internal political changes from dialogue and the logic of rapprochement. That linkage is going to provoke an allergic reaction, an instant allergic reaction. I'm talking about the Cuban government. Number two, understand that if the Cuban government were to make concessions, it has responded more to unconditional dialogue and discreet diplomacy than to public pressure and accusations. That is a historical part. Number three, understand that the concessions and assurances that both parties can give directly to each other in the middle of a negotiation process have been more effective than claiming commitment and statements on political positions and intentions. So as long as we don't have a negotiation going on, everything is going to be more limited. Number four, understand that despite the ideological siege and isolation within which Cuba is right now, Cuba is less alone today politically than ever before. In Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, but also in Europe. Cuban relations with Russia and China are the best since the end of the Cold War. Number five, a dam between Cuba and the United States can, of course, further ease internal tensions of all kinds and facilitate national dialogue, which is not a link, it is a fact. Number six, many more things to share with Cuba and the United States, many more things from the United States to share with Cuba than business science, than teaching us how to manage the private business. For instance, local government management. I think this is a key issue within Cuban reforms. To me, it's more a key issue than the private sector. But anyway, it's a fundamental issue that you can find in Cuban government documents and political speech. And the fact that as a consequence of all this year, as a consequence of the crisis, and as a consequence of COVID, the problem of poverty, the problem of poor neighborhoods is now on the front line. Then the question of community work, of local development, the question of fighting poverty at the grassroots level where poverty is taking place is today more important, more a priority than ever. And that may be an area of cooperation with Cuba today, particularly because of the circumstance. And finally, number seven, artists, academics, scientists have created a third track. It is not a government-to-government track, but it has proved to be influential on both sides. And that third track is presenting a completely different portrait of artists, of intellectuals, and of scientists than the one that is perceived because of all these turbulence. The July 11 or the 27 November, and particularly the 15 November. So I think that is also a question that should be promoted and used fully. And my last point has to do with the anticipation we have, not only me, but some other students of Cuban politics, the anticipation of a new Cuban policy towards the emigres, towards Cubans who live abroad. That, I think, this is not part of the US-Cuba agenda, but this is part of the US-Cuba social, political, and cultural environment. And I think that the question of opening up and restoring channels, communication channels, remittances, travels, but also to facilitate a new policy, a new legal framework for that Cuban American community may contribute today more than ever before to this new environment between the two sides. Well, this is what I am writing about.
Thank you. Thank you. Rafael has, I suspect, given us a preview of the third essay in his series. If you go to our blog, you'll see the first two essays. And as soon as the third one is available, we'll also put it up there. They're showing up originally in Spanish and on Cuba. And then he's sending us a personal translation, not a Google translation, so that it's readable and comprehensive. There was a logic of the order of this that has been frustrated. So in a sense, now we're going to go, Rafael has given us more of a forward-looking sense of how things could improve if there was a willingness and interest in improvement. We now want to go back a bit to the problems that developed and that were at a pitch point for November 15th. What prompted me to spend a lot of budget we didn't have to get down there in time to actually see for myself and be able to say from contact with random people and old friends what July had meant and what had happened in November. I must say that I went down having watched all the videos and read a lot of the blogs and posts from the organizers of November 15th, and hearing the official statements from the US government. I expected that this was going to be a major historical moment in Cuban history that I really wanted to be there to see and be able to share with folks on our mailing list. I could have just waited and read Ed Augustin's piece in The Nation, which is a very good description. So we're going to ask, you can see on our blog the link to it, but now we're going to ask him to add his own personal take, given the limits of where he was able to find a connection, and we'll see how it goes. Ed publishes not just in The Nation, but also in the New York Times and The Guardian. So he's a well-established 8-year experienced journalist in Cuba. Ed.
Thanks very much, and apologies to everybody listening in that there's a bit of background noise. The only place I could find to plug my laptop in is a bar. I'm just opposite the Havana Libre, formerly the Havana Hilton, as many of you will know. John, is there any particular point you'd like me to speak to?
Well, I think that if you just imagine you're trying to tell people what happened on the 15th and why it happened that way, how it relates to the predecessor events of the 11th of July, and then what your sense is of how things are developing post November 15th. So out of that, whatever you feel moved to comment
Okay.
on.
So I'll speak mostly about my experiences reporting on it. I mean, it was very, I felt very tense in the days before November the 15th. I'd met a lot of the organizers from Archipelago, which is the Facebook group, which before November the 15th had approximately 35,000 members, and a smorgasbord of different political ideologies, different tendencies. And one thing they had in common is that they were either looking to substantially change the Cuban system from within, or you could see from the comments, lots of people would prefer, obviously, another government. And I met lots of them. I spent significant time with Junio Garcia, who was the, as I'm sure almost everybody knows, very much the face of the movement, very articulate, and other coordinators, other people. That there were 36, about just over 30 coordinators on the Facebook group, and I spent time with about 5 of them. And I have to admit, I found them very likable, very sincere, at least the ones I met, in their belief about how things ought to change. I haven't met that much of the traditional Cuban opposition, but from what I read and from what I hear, that's not a descriptor that generally gets applied. A lot of people, some of the people in the traditional opposition, from what I hear, were interested in the financial remuneration, and this wasn't a sense I got from Archipelago. And the main stated aims were release of what they saw as political prisoners after July the 11th, expanded space for freedom of expression, and the right to protest. And it became very, very tense in the days leading up to the 15th of November, because people are thinking, what's gonna happen? Are there going to be loads of people on the street? If so, is there going to be a repeat of the violence both from the state towards protesters that we saw in July, and in some cases from protesters towards police that we saw in July? And there was, certainly in the bubble that I inhabit in Havana, the people around me were very tense leading up to it. It didn't happen. And if I speak in a personal capacity, I have a very contradictory position, because on the one hand, I think, God, if I was Cuban, I might well be in that group of protesters. You know, I'm British, as my accent probably gives away. In Britain, I've been involved in protests for, you know, expanded democracy. But then I had another side of me thinking about the dynamics in which Cuba finds itself in. If there is a big protest, it's going to strengthen the hand of those in South Florida and Washington who are pushing for even further sanctions. And that, in my analysis at least, those further sanctions would lead to a huge detriment of the economic rights of Cubans to, you know, have power, have running water, earn decent salaries. And I think particularly poorer Cubans, those that don't have access to hard currency, who can't use the dollar shops, who in normal times would be receiving more remittances, those people would be hardest hit. And I also think that, paradoxically, if these, in many cases, pro-democracy protesters had successfully pulled off a big, ostensibly pro-democracy protest, the result might have been a crackdown on space for democracy, both in the first instance by the Cuban state, but also states in general. I think if you look at history, that are under big internal pressure tend to crack down, tend to feel threatened. And so I had this contradictory feel. I do think that politics in Cuba is polarizing. Of course, from the protest organizers' point of view, and also from those in the Biden administration and the international media that, and maybe I'm guilty of it, that somewhat hyped up the protests, they were a flop. They were a complete bust. And I think that there's no dispute about that. I think you see now Archipelago crumbling. You see many of the lead organizers saying that they don't want to be part of it anymore. And I think that Junio Garcia's, having left Cuba in the way he did, has has really disappointed many of those within that group. I think that it's worth pointing out that politics in Cuba has polarized an awful lot in recent years as the economic situation's got much worse, and as the government is perceived to be not listening to or unable to respond or unwilling to respond to people's demands over the last couple of years, and particularly over the last 12 months, it's got a lot worse. And so the seeds are set for continued protest that I think is going to happen in some form or other. I was speaking to an economist just the other day, Emily Morris, who's a British economist that studies the Cuban economy closely. And she told me that she estimates that over the last 2 years, the foreign currency inflows that the Cuban state receives have been cut in half. And I think that bears thinking about. I mean, think of any government in the world. Think what would happen if they received half the amount of foreign currency inflows. And in her analysis, that's mainly attributable to 2 factors: COVID, that wiped out tourism and did a lot more, and the 243 Trump sanctions, each one of which were aimed at cutting foreign currency inflows to Cuba. So the state's under huge financial stress, and we see this every day in Cuba. Most Cubans live it far more acutely than I do, being a privileged foreigner. And this creates the kind of conditions of huge discontent. And then within that, last November, I think it was the 27th of November, you had at the time unprecedented protests in terms of size outside the culture ministry. That's almost a year ago today, I think. And many of those same people that were organizing in Archipelago a couple of weeks ago were there. And from what I can see, their position has radicalized substantially over that last year. And of course, a big part of that is the failed negotiations between them and the representatives of the Cuban state, people in the culture ministry. And I think it's interesting to look at how the United States funding of, to take one example, quote unquote, independent media plays an example in that. So that night when the culture ministry opened up to negotiate, there were 35 negotiators. 5 of those either worked for or had worked for media outlets that receive State Department funding. Now, he who pays the piper doesn't always call the tune, but many of those people work for what can be, I think, fairly branded as anti-Castro media outlets that, let's say, always have a very strong tendency to focus on the negatives in Cuba and not talk about, for example, how the sanctions play a role in creating huge problems in Cuba. And so I think that would have contributed to the Cuban state feeling threatened, and I think it contributed to a breakdown in negotiations. Not necessarily what they said in the negotiations, but the very fact that from the Cuban point of view, the Cuban state's point of view, they're going to be thinking, these are people who are financed indirectly by, the enemy. They would rather simply, I think, brand them as mercenaries. It's already a state that feels threatened. And I think, so to speak, the structural power of the United States has played a role in helping a dialogue that could have perhaps been resolved, not amicably, but could have been resolved, let's say, within the system in another circumstance. It's helped it collapse. And I think we see a polarization of Cuban politics within Cuba that certainly I've never witnessed. And there is increasingly a tendency, I think, for a rather than a democratic opposition in some senses, and of course many of the stripes are people that want multi-party elections or direct voting for president. There are people who can genuinely be characterized as pro-democrats, many people, but also in what the media tends to call pro-democracy protesters, there are people who are Trump voters, are people who have no problem with Donald Trump. And I think the rise of a Trump-supporting internal Cuban opposition is very noteworthy. And I think it's not unlinked to the fact that the Cuban American community in South Florida, according to polls, swung heavily behind Trump, or swung substantially behind Trump. And that, as an academic told me a week ago or so, the diaspora is back in the sense that because there's relatively uncensored internet here compared to China and Vietnam and other one-party states, and because Facebook and Instagram and Twitter are not censored, and because now over 4 million Cubans have mobile phones, and because of the family links and the financial flows between Florida and other places and Cuba, you have a lot of roce, a lot of contact in terms of information flows and cultural flows from people in the diaspora that support Trump. So that mixed with the anti-Castro, the anti-regime journalism that's very, very partisan, that now has a way in to Cuba, is creating, and with the economic warfare that's been ramped up, and with COVID, are all creating a new dynamic on the islands that could be rather roughly put as the politics of hate. I don't want to simplify it. There's lots of, let's say center-left people and people who are Democrats through and through in this opposition. But one current is definitely that.
Thank you, Ed. My experience, to say, was shockingly not what I expected, and even more when you simply were seeing things as they showed up on the internet or in the mass media in the U.S. It led me to think something else would happen than happened, and when nothing in effect happened, there's then theories about why it didn't happen, and I think there's then the interesting question about how if the tree didn't fall, how did that get interpreted in Washington? What would, I mean, one of my optimistic assessments was that since there hadn't been a confrontation, regardless of what the reasons were, whether it was repression or whether it was total misjudgment on the part of the organizers of the political moment, whatever the reason is, that it should have disabused people in Washington of their optimistic illusions of color revolutions, and this is finally it. This is the moment when the Cuban Revolution ends. But I turned to Bill LeoGrande, who probably better than anyone else understands what's going on in the Congress and in the White House and State Department, and see what his interpretation is of how they responded to the dog that didn't bark. Got to unmute yourself.
Thanks, John, and thanks to everybody who's joined us today. I mean, the United States government went all in on endorsing the November 15th protests. The U.S. Embassy used its Twitter account to actively promote the protests. Senior U.S. officials did the same in the days leading up to the protest. So, for example, on the 14th of November, Brian Nichols, Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere, said, "The Cuban people plan to peacefully demonstrate for democracy, prosperity, and fundamental rights and freedoms. We support them and call on the Cuban government to listen to the will of the Cuban people. Hashtag 15N. Same day, Secretary of State Blinken said, "The Cuban regime has the opportunity to hear and listen to the Cuban people during peaceful demonstrations on hashtag 15N and to demonstrate respect for human rights. We commend the brave Cuban people for showing the strength of their will and of their voice." National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on the 15th of November called the 15N demonstrators the voice of the Cuban people and said, "The United States is committed to supporting the agency of the Cuban people as they seek to promote democratic change." So it seems to me there are two notable things about these statements. First, the presumption that the organizers and participants in 15N would, in effect, be speaking for the Cuban people at large, which obviously turned out not to be true. And second, that the United States government really has any business endorsing movements to oppose another country's government. You can imagine how the United States would have reacted if senior Cuban officials had endorsed the Black Lives Matter protests and the Cuban embassy had actively been engaged in promoting. On the 16th of November, after the dog that didn't bark, as John put it, after the demonstrations failed to actually materialize, the State Department blamed the failure entirely on repression by the government. Now, to be sure, the government detained or arrested almost all the organizers, which prevented any of them from marching. But that does not account for the fact that there were no followers. That is to say that almost nobody showed up to march or even to do the less risky things that Archipelago had asked them to do, like banging empty pots or wearing white. I just don't think that repression is a sufficient explanation for the lack of participation. We have seen in other Latin American countries, in the face of much greater repression, thousands and thousands of people turn out day after day to confront their government. Just in the past few years, just in Latin America, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Venezuela. So where does US policy stand now in the aftermath of 15N? I think, Biden administrations have dug themselves into a hole and they just keep digging. They kept Trump's sanctions, violating their own campaign promises and essentially betraying the moderate Cuban American Democrats who had supported engagement and voted for Joe Biden. Predictably, keeping Trump's policy has not satisfied the Cuban American hardliners who never supported Biden in the first place. Biden is still under attack from Rubio, Salazar, Otaola, and company. The administration officials attribute this flip-flop on Cuba policy to the fact that, as Jake Sullivan told Fareed Zakaria on MSNBC the other day, circumstances have changed. Well, so what exactly has changed? US interests haven't changed. They're the same as they were in 2014. Cuba's willingness to have better relations with the United States hasn't changed. I think all that's really changed is the administration's expectation of whether regime change policy might actually work this time. So by endorsing the demonstrations on November 15th, they really put their money on the idea that the July demonstration was the beginning of a long-awaited regime change, and 15N represented stage 2 of this process. And obviously they were wrong about that. But it seems to me there's no evidence from what administration officials have been saying that they are disabused of this idea that regime change is possible. Or on the other hand, if they really do know better, it appears that they still want to use this idea cynically as an excuse for keeping Trump's policy in place for essentially domestic political reasons. So what's the prospect for any policy change in the foreseeable future of even doing the minimum things they promised to do during the campaign on remittances, travel, and consular service? I have to say, I think the prospects are pretty dim. Their stated policy on remittances at this point is tougher than Donald Trump's. According to Ned Price, it is unacceptable that any amount of money from remittances go to the Cuban government, which means that no remittances by wire service can go, since some Cuban financial institution on the other end has to handle it, and they're going to charge at least a minimum service fee to cover the costs of doing that. The administration still seems unwilling to fully reopen consular services, at least until the riddle of the Havana syndrome is solved, which it may never be. And moreover, right now, Cuban vaccines are not recognized in the United States, and so Cubans can't come to the United States without a US recognized vaccination. Nothing has been done so far to reopen any of the bilateral dialogues on issues of mutual interest that Obama began and that Trump canceled. And nobody in the administration is publicly saying a word about travel, although one unnamed official did say, "We are not going to rescue the Cuban tourism industry." So I think the administration has basically locked itself into a policy, into Donald Trump's policy, one that's harsher than any Democratic president's policy since Lyndon Johnson more than half a century ago. So I would just say in conclusion, if you voted for Joe Biden because he promised to restore Obama's policy of engagement, you've been, as Cubans say, engañado. You've been cheated. And if you contributed to his campaign based on that promise, you should probably ask for a refund.
I'll do that tomorrow. That's fairly helpful, though disappointing. The one small positive note, although it's also a negative note, is that Jim McGovern, Congressman McGovern, who has the status of being head of the Rules Committee in the House, has been circulating a Dear Colleague letter. And we'll put out the link for it, or again, I think that's on the blog page, but if it's not, I'll get it there. And unfortunately, the last tally we heard was 53 co-signers. If that had been done during the Trump administration, we probably would have had 200 co-signers. So that it's not just a consequence of events in Cuba, it's a consequence of the politics of the way the Biden administration has been approaching a whole slew of problems, which Cuba is just one of them, and you wonder the consequences of the election, as Bill's mentioned. Rafael, I wonder, first of all, somebody asked if we could show everybody, and I'm gonna do that now as we go into the discussion phase. Rafael, what is it that we've heard from Bill that the US government has learned absolutely nothing from what took place? What's your sense of what the Cuban government has learned from what took place? That being tough works, or that they really need to figure out how to deal with the underlying discontent? You got to unmute yourself. We're still not hearing you. You're not muted, but we're not hearing you. Don't know what we're dealing with now. Okay, Rafael, why don't you try to fiddle with something at your end on your microphone, because you're talking, you're not muted, but we're not hearing a word. If you just unplug your line and plug it back in, maybe that's worth trying. High-tech solutions to, no. I'm going to stop your video and see if we get your audio. All right, why can you speak now? We're not getting anywhere. Okay. Try signing off and signing on again. Maybe that will work. And meanwhile, Ed, do you have some thoughts about what from your contacts, what's been learned at the Cuban end from what happened?
What's been learned post November the 15th?
Yeah, I mean, I say you could argue from, if you were a Cuban government person, that it was 100% successful. They managed by a variety of means to discourage the worst possible situation, which would have been another media-rich confrontation with between security forces and thousands of protesters. So they stopped that. It didn't happen. But I think Bill is right that it's not just a question of it not happening because of the control of the leaders, but it didn't happen because I think the leaders were way out of their depth and totally misjudged what the popular situation was.
I think Bill's point that it cannot be explained, that the fact that the protest didn't materialize cannot be explained by repression alone, that is unquestionably true. I'm kicking myself because I had to write a short piece for The Guardian the day of the protest, and I was multitasking, and I didn't make that point. I went along with Le Pensée Unique, and the Cuban government squashes, I can't remember, probably had a better verb than that, but snuffs out protests, and I didn't think to just flick the line in that it wasn't only that. But that's unquestionably true. It was amazing as the hours went by to watch it not materialize, because especially with social media now, you're scrolling down Twitter or whatever and just waiting, and you see videos of one person in Santa Clara hitting a pot and pan on their doorstep, another person in a Cuban flag in Santiago being arrested. I've got to say that my impression is that the ease with which the Cuban government snuffed these protests out was impressive. I don't say impressive positively, but impressive. I got the impression that day they were completely in control. 100 or so people under arrest, according to Cubalex, which is a US-funded human rights organization, they'd say, who inflates the figures substantially, I know, of how many people are in jail, because they include in political prisoners all people who were arrested on July the 11th, including those who stole from from shops, who in any country would be arrested. They include those political prisoners. The last time I checked, I might be out of date, but the day after the protest, they recorded 11 arrests, apart from the house detentions. I think the government would be full of glee with how it was handled. It couldn't, from their point of view, have been handled any better. You didn't have any spectacular violence. You didn't have any spectacular protests, which of course us as journalists would have latched onto and hugely magnified it. Right? There've been, as Bill's saying, like there are very big protests in many countries within Latin America, many of which that go on much longer than one day. But because it's Cuba, it's always under the microscope in a different context. And so neither that happened, neither significant state violence nor protests. But yeah, the fact that in the end it coincided with tourists coming back, or at least the formal opening of the border, with schools reopening, with COVID less than 10 times, over 10 times lower than it was back in July, was really a boon to the government, and it made it easy for them to package a propaganda campaign and argue to people saying, do you really want disorder? Or after a long, arduous lockdown that we're all tired of, do you want to seize this moment of a ray of light of normality? And of course, the proof is in the pudding. It worked. So I think the promise of glimmers of hope, of tourism coming back and social life coming back, was very, very big. And the fact that the vaccination campaign has been so impressive. I was just checking yesterday, Cuba's in the top 5 now of countries that have fully vaccinated the most people. It's second in the Americas, only to Chile. Chile's vaccinated, I think, 83% of the population, Cuba just over 80. It's vaccinated more than Canada, the United States, Britain, France, Japan, China. There's only a handful of countries. And that in itself, the government is not shy about banging on about the huge victory of that. And so that created a circumstance that was just so different to November. I think in terms of lessons learned, I get the impression that Diaz-Canel is showing his face now in Los Barrios Marginales. I think he's been very, very shy throughout his presidency of just, walking around and being with people. I sometimes suspect that they're very worried that just only needs to be one person like booing or throwing a tomato and that will be pounced on. The tomatoes are quite expensive at the moment. And there has been, I think, a big effort for them to show that they're more engaged with normal people, essentially photo ops. But I think that ultimately in the medium term, I hate to be an economic kind of determinist, but I think that any government would be on the rocks, seriously on the rocks, or have fallen if the economic situation was so bad. So what they need is for this new variant not to turn out to be as bad as some are worrying, and for tourism to stay open. That will be a lifeline. And they also need a softening of the sanctions, which in Bill's analysis is not going to happen anytime soon. I think until the economic situation improves, I think it's only to be expected that there'll be huge discontent among significant sectors of the population. That, let's remember, Cuba's been in crisis for 3 decades. That's an extraordinary situation, you know, and so many governments would have fallen much earlier. I mean, and again, we go back to this thing, a combination of repression and fear, and also the fact that people remember how much how much better things got back in the 70s at the quote unquote triumph of the revolution. And so there's a big demographic problem from the government's point of view, which is that people who lived it in the years where things are working are slowly dying out. Sorry, that's someone making a smoothie. I'll finish now. And a younger generation that's only known crisis and talking about the blockade as a principal problem, which so many people say is a justification. I don't see it as justification, but it's perceived by many to be an excuse and justification. Every year that goes on and the crisis continues, the support for the government, I think, looking at it simply, is likely to drop. And the economic situation here in Cuba is in many ways unbelievable. You know, like when I write articles, when I speak to friends back home, I'll kind of describe it, and they don't kind of get it because it's so different to life in home counties in England, where I'm from, and so different to life where I'm sure where many people are listening from. It's really unbelievable how long these queues are, and until that can be addressed, I think we can only expect more discontent and more attempts at organizing opposition.
Rafael, have you been able to hear all this, and can you now speak? We're still not hearing you. No, we're still not hearing you. So there's something, do you have do you have a microphone in your computer that you can just unplug unplug the earphones and see if we can hear you that way? Just pull it out of the input jack and see if no, we're still not hearing you. So someone suggested you should write in the chat. I think that you've got too much to say to fit it into the chat, but I think the question of what has been learned on the Cuban side, I want to throw one other just personal observation in that if just watching Archipelago, it seems to me they started out with a very well sculpted public relations campaign. You know, it might have been entirely indigenous. It might have had some professional assistance from the people in the US who design these things. I have no idea, but it certainly was set up in such a way, Rafael, we can't hear a word you're saying. It was done in such a way as the government was really, looked like it was going to be in a trap, that if it granted the permit, that who knew what would happen. If it didn't grant the permit, it would be condemned for its attitude on human rights, and there would still be a big demonstration, and it would redound even more negatively about the government. But that didn't happen. The notable thing that happened was that Junior and his wife had obviously prepared to go to Spain, had applied for a visa and disappeared on the day of the protest, basically, and then showed up in Spain. And one of the things that Junior has said, which he said more explicitly in Spain, is that he's against the embargo. And I don't know whether there's any scenario in which this great hero of Congress and the US media could use his standing to actually undermine support for the embargo. I mean, his logic is the logic that we all know, that the embargo strengthens the hardline position in Cuba, and ending the embargo would lead to more dramatic changes than a zillion dollars in US democracy funding. But at any rate, I want to, Bill, do you have anything? What I want to do, unless Rafael can figure out how to let us hear him. Did you try unplugging your earphones from, not from your head, but from your laptop so that the laptop microphone is working? Still nothing. Okay.
Hey, I'd like to say a couple of words about why I think that the demonstrations didn't happen. In addition to some of the things that have already been mentioned, I mean, it's important to say, you know, the government declared it illegal, so it was risky potentially for people to participate. And, you know, they had a lot of counter programming, as Ed was talking about, in terms of celebrations of the tourism reopening, sending the kids back to school, the anniversary of Havana. Hang on just a moment.
And it was Archipelago that chose the November 15th date when it walked
Yes,
away.
that's right. No, I know, I understand that. But the two things that I think are particularly important. One is, keep in mind, Archipelago was a Facebook group, not an organization, created by artists and intellectuals. And the political program for the march was essentially one of freedom of expression, and democratic change sort of not defined beyond that. And so I think, you know, they didn't have any organization on the ground to actually organize demonstrations. They had to rely on their partnership with the Council for Transition, which is a coalition of very traditional exile groups who've never been successful at organizing demonstrations on the ground. After, you know, every couple of years, they try to have a big set of demonstrations, and they've never been successful doing it. Second thing is, I think that the program of free expression and political democracy just did not speak to the issue that we know is the #1 issue for the great majority of Cubans, and that is the economic situation and their standard of living. And so their message just didn't connect with the broader public. And I think, you know, Junior Garcia actually acknowledged that to a certain extent at the press conference he held in Spain, when he said, we can't just organize artists, we have to speak to Cuban families. So I think that was the class difference, if you will, between the people organizing this protest and the general public really was an important component for the reason that it just didn't resonate with people.
Jeff Thale asks, I'm going to take a couple of these questions and throw them to Ed and Bill, and if Rafael can get sound. Then I want to shift to the end to a lot of the practical questions that Rita could answer, and if people who are here for the more policy-oriented stuff at that point want to sign off, that's fine, and the folks who are from the travel sector may want to stay on for some more practical discussions. Anyway, Jeff asked, while the Archipelago demonstrations failed to turn out significant numbers of people, July 11th suggested high levels of discontent that are likely to continue in the coming months. While tourism may go up, US sanctions are, as Bill said, likely to continue. The economy may not get worse, but it's not going to get a lot better. What can the Cuban government do to respond to popular discontent on the one side, and is discontent likely to manifest itself in some political fashion? Let me just do a footnote, Jeff, that Americans, we're aware of the American part of tourism, but the non-Cuban American sector was about 400,000 or 500,000, and most of that in the last year of Obama was cruise passengers who didn't bring a lot of income into Cuba. So the main income question is European and Canadian in terms of the big ticket resort areas. So, but if someone would like to respond to Jeff's political question about how can the Cuban government, what can it do to respond to popular discontent? And is it likely to have some political expression? Rafael, any better? No, still no. We're still not hearing you. Ed, do you want to? This is a new mystery. Ed, do you want to talk about that?
I'll have a crack. I'm not sure I've got anything particularly insightful to say, especially compared to Rafael and Bill, but I think that there's no way the discontent is going away. It's so much worse than it was a couple of years ago, so much more difficult. There are hardly any antibiotics. I mean, they're coming in, but as soon as they come into hospitals and pharmacies, they go. And it's just very common to speak to people who, you know, almost everyone will know someone who arrives at the pharmacy looking for medicines, let's say, for a loved one or for themselves, or for some vitamins, and they might be dispatching vitamins that day, antibiotics that day, and you'll mark in line at 4 in the morning or even the night before to get them, and you're number 8 in the line, and by the time that it's your turn, they've already gone. I mean, in that situation, there's no way that the discontent cannot continue, and that's just one factor. I think that the government here is very, very keen to make sure that there is no extended power cuts, because I think they studied that quite carefully. I read the other day that oil shipments have increased substantially, about 50% to Cuba since July the 11th. And so there may well have been a special request put in there. And from their point of view, it's no longer summer, which historically, you know, that the Malacon-Asso in the 90s, and of course the July protests happened in the summer. So I think at least in terms of the seasons, we're probably into an easier patch. But I think until that the economic situation improves, certainly there's going to be mass content, and it's just palpable at the moment. And I'm in Havana. You know, I can't even imagine how bad it is in the provinces in the east. You hear it's always harder in the provinces than in Havana. It's richer here, where most of an inordinate amount of tourists come here. When there are remittances, and remittances in kind will start happening soon, before now, because of the flights. People in Havana are always first to receive them. And so if it's bad here, just imagine what it is in the other parts of the country. And Havana is only a sixth of the Cuban population. So strongly, I strongly think that the discontent will continue for a long time. I think the government's capacity to resolve that is very limited. I mean, it just seems obvious to me that if you're sanctioned by the most powerful country in the world very heavily, in a time where a pandemic's also wiped out your tourism, and even now they've reopened, but what capacity do people have to really plan? You know, like my parents plan holidays 6 months in advance. Lots of people don't know that Cuba's opened up once again. You know, like it's not going to be a magic bullet that comes in tourism again. I think it's going to take many months for it to get up to significant levels. Even some big hotels in Havana aren't opening until January. So I think that the state itself is anticipating very low levels for the first few months. And that's in the best case scenario, that the pandemic is under control. So obviously they're not in control of COVID completely, although to the extent they are able to, with vaccinations and other things, they've done, I think, on balance, a marvelous job, all things taken into consideration. And with the sanctions, you know, they've got some tiny room to try and make the sanctions less strong, but ultimately it depends on Washington. The changes they can do here: apply the economic reforms that they've been saying they're going to apply for many, many years and have been either unwilling or unable to. Somebody asked me whether or not that's more likely to happen now because of the protests. My gut feeling is yes, because it's so obvious that change is required. But I don't have any special insight into that because Cuba's one of the only countries I can imagine being in Latin America where I don't have contacts with ministers. I mean, it's all very, very opaque and intransparent, and it's normal. You know, I've never interviewed Diaz-Canel. I don't know his thinking. I don't have a clear grasp on the power dynamics. I'm sure I know Bill and Rafael do. But my guess is that that's going to engender a reform process. But that in itself is dangerous because it's going to lead, obviously, to greater inequality within Cuba, which is already far greater than it was, say, 20 years ago. And so that's going to grow. Rising tides will lift all boats. The market does create wealth, but that can seriously chip away at the political legitimacy of this regime as those reforms are put into process. So I think the discontent will definitely continue. I think government has limited capacity to improve the economic situation over the medium term. And as for whether or not we're likely to see new political opposition, I think the answer is yes, but I'd echo what Bill said, that just that it's so fledgling, it's so young, it's so weak, it's so disorganized, it has no ground game. I mean, Archipelago is a Facebook group. You know, like, this is not a political party with PR gurus and local party organization. I think the Communist Party of Cuba is firmly in command here. I think if they're, and just to say what I said before, that it was like swatting away a fly, putting the people under house arrest on November. So I think we're some time off before we get to any situation similar to, say, Venezuela or, you know, most other.
Okay, I'm going to put you on the microphone. Okay.
Where there's an
speakerphone.
organized opposition. So that would be my comment.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm speaking with Rafael to try and figure out whether I can put
hear
him.
me now?
Oh,
You can hear me now?
yes, yes.
Okay. Well,
Go ahead.
yes. Well, this is what I wanted to say. I think that as for the impact of all this political turbulence, I think that it has been a mixed impact. On one side, the defensive, no, the defensive impact, that is to rally around the flag. But on the other side, there's a more awareness and more critical awareness of our problems. And that is part of the impact among people that call themselves socialists or revolutionaries. I mean, the idea that, yes, the junior project that was wrong, etc., but the problems are there. And we need to understand that those problems has to be solved. So the question of public protest, the July 11 protests that were not created by Junior, but were created by the circumstances, those problems has to be addressed. Today, I see more TV shows that are really debates. This is completely new. I don't know if Ed agrees with me, but we have more shows, more TV shows focused on real debates. Sometimes the debate is not that critical, but sometimes the debate is real. And I think this is new. And I think this is reflecting a consciousness about the reality of this problem. We need to debate our problems, and the Cuban media, the Cuban official media, must be there to show that those debates. So I think that the consequence of all this political conflict is not a narrower political space for expressing disagreement. This is not what I see around me, and this is not what I see even in the Cuban media. On the other side, there are a few things that should be revised and may be revised because of these critical circumstances. For instance, what I mentioned about Cuban policy towards Cubans who live abroad. Cubans who live abroad are a substantial part of tourism. Those Cubans who visit Cuba now in December or in the summer or all year long are making an important contribution to the tourism industry. So the Ministry of Tourism and the Cuban government policies must understand and must recognize the importance of those Cubans who live abroad that are not just sending remittances, but visiting and using those facilities. Cubans are also part of this tourism market. Cubans who live here. Under the pandemic, in 2020, in the summer, there were more Varadero hotels full with Cubans than ever before. Cubans who live here. And that is an alternative view about how to develop tourism in Cuba. And finally, I think that there's more awareness, there's an official awareness, people that I talk with who are in the government, about leaving aside, leaving behind the policies, the uniformistic policies, if I can speak like that. So uniformization, which is not egalitarianism, it is something different. Uniformization is one fundamental illness of Cuban socialism. So the idea that the way to address the same problems in Guantanamo, the same problems in Havana, or the same problems in Mayabeque, Pinar del Rio, or Santi Spiritus, that the idea that those problems could be solved using the same instruments is not adopted today as it was in the past. So the central planning mentality that we have solutions for problems all over the country is, to me, heavily questioned today. So we are trying to address these problems. The government is trying, the local government are trying to address their problems in different ways and using the potential, the different resources, human resources that are available in the different territories. So the question of territorializing policies is also an interesting lesson of all this situation, which is not just, of course, the demonstrations. And the idea that, of course, young people, youngsters, must have the room, and not only the room given by their parents, but the room that they have to use, their own room, and to approach the problems and to discuss the problems in the way they think they should. So the recognition of all that, of that malaise among Cubans, not in the counter-revolutionary ranks, but in the Cuban people, I think it is also a gain of all these last 24 months. And I think that the question of freedom of expression, the question of freedom to travel, the question of freedom of association, because we will have next year, and we are almost next year, we will have next year a legislation calendar that is planning the law of associations. And that law of association is a fundamental contribution to all these accumulated problems. Talking about political questions.
Great.
Did you hear?
Can I just jump in, John? I want
Sure, I just want to say to Rafael how appreciative I am. He finally got the sound because that was really helpful. Go ahead, Bill.
I was just, I think, Ed summarized very well the fact that the government doesn't have the economic resources it needs to address the problems that it faces. So in a situation like that, the government's best bet to begin to reduce the level of discontent is to demonstrate to people that it understands their problems, that it's listening to their problems, that it's searching for solutions, and that it's as responsive as it can be. I think, that Cuban political institutions haven't done a very good job of that historically. And, Rafael has sketched out a vision, and he's written about this previously, of a more decentralized system that will be more responsive to people at the local level, as he was just describing, as one way of going about that. The other thing I'd say is that the government really ought to be taking whatever resources it has and devoting them to dealing with problems of food and medical supplies and energy, even if that means that some of the capital investments for the future that they would like to be making have to be delayed.
I would like to add something, if I may. Can I add something?
Sure, oh, sure, yes.
This is good news. Today, like every Friday morning, I went to the food market. So tomatoes price 100 a pound, decreased 2 days ago to 70 and to 50. And I found today in one market, tomatoes at 35 a pound. Plenty of onions.
You'll have to tell me where, Rafael.
K and 17. K and 17. 35 a pound. Well, not the best tomatoes in the world. Not like a Washington tomatoes, perhaps. Not like the one Bill is growing in his backyard, but tomatoes finally. And you have as many onions as you want. 40 pesos. With 40, 50 pesos, I bought wonderful onions. So all of a sudden we have onions and tomatoes. So we are almost triumphing, almost getting to victory. For the market, this is something called the market.
Ed, before we switch over to Rita to answer all of the very practical questions that her colleagues in the travel sector have raised, do you want to say anything in terms of broader comments and policy futures?
Not sure if I can think of anything profound to say. I agree with Rafael that over the last few years in the state media, particularly on television, there is more diversity, there's more debate, but I do think it's still very clearly within strict limits. Like you don't switch on the TV and see people talking in the way that, for example, many people in Archipelago were talking. I think that's obvious to any Cubans, but there is definitely greater diversity. That's noticeable, yeah, perhaps that will communicate to people, as Bill's saying, that the government is listening. But I do think there's a very big sector of the population, particularly younger, that it doesn't really matter what the government's saying, because I've always found it amazing in Cuba how many young people don't exaggerate too much, but almost don't even hear the television when it's on, because they're so tuned out from it, because the discourse has been so similar for so long. And so, yeah, on the one hand, I recognize that it's much more diverse than it was, but on the other hand, I think it's still not, I think it's too narrow still to resonate with big sectors of the population. My sense is that most Cubans I know, and I'm always very hesitant to make sweeping statements, because I know, dozens of people, maybe hundreds of people in one spot of Cuba. But most Cubans I know, whether they're for or against the government, do recognize, I think, that the government is at least trying and failing in a lot of senses, but trying and in some sense on their side. It's a horribly superficial comment to make, but what one hears a lot, especially given the food scarcity, is that the optics aren't good, that both the president and the prime minister, they've got substantially overweight, and there's lots of cheap comments about just look at everything they're eating, and lots of cheap things on Facebook that pop up. And I think that there's an image problem there, which I'd have thought would be fairly easy to solve. And yeah, I mean, amid all the doom and gloom, apart from Rafael's good news about the tomatoes and the onions, I think it's important to put things in context that it's very easy to find people in Havana that eat badly. It's very difficult to find, it's difficult to find just people who are really hungry in the nutritional term. And I think even given all of the huge inefficiencies of the government, jaw-dropping inefficiencies sometimes, and the hugely difficult economic situation that under for primarily, I think, external circumstances, it's noteworthy, I think, that unlike most Latin American countries, you don't walk around and see very, very hungry people. You walk around actually and see far more overweight people than hungry people. And a similar thing could be said for a lack of homeless people. Every time I see somebody sleeping, often when I see someone sleeping outside, I'll go and speak to the person. Not when they're asleep, but when they're awake, and say like what's going on. And overwhelmingly, it's that they have a house, not very good, or they're just a bit eccentric and they like sleeping outside. But that kind of basic social net, creaking though it is still in some sense functioning in Cuba. And I think given the fact that half of the hard currency revenues have been cut over the last 2 years, I think that's no mean feat.
Bill, any last thoughts before we go to Rita?
Yeah, just very briefly. I think at this point, Cuba has to proceed as if the United States is not going to be a reliable partner economically or politically for the foreseeable future, and just simply cultivate partnerships with other international actors, whether it's the European Union or Russia or China or Canada or whatever country is willing to actually act as a responsible partner. But clearly the United States is not. Now, having said that, I know I've been probably very discouraging sounded very discouraging to people. But so I would encourage people who would like to see a better policy to not give up hope completely, and keep pestering your members of Congress and the Biden administration to actually do the things they promised to do. The Dear Colleague letter that was mentioned earlier is a good thing to try to get your member of Congress to sign. Congress itself is probably not going to enact anything in the immediate future, given the fact that, Democrats in Congress are not going to want to cross a Democratic president, except for Joe Manchin and Sinema. So, you've got to just keep sending that message. The White House has to just keep hearing that message from every possible direction, that people expect the president to keep the promises he made during the campaign. And I think, that's what we can do from here.
Rafael, last words.
Well, let me say something about U.S. policy towards Cuba. I think that, as in the past, the idea that next Christmas in Havana is not happening, and after a while, the Cuban government is still there. It may be some voices within this administration that may point out that it is time to begin discreet diplomacy approach. Since if they want to have any influence on Cuba, on the current and particularly the future Cuba, they must be sure about that. They must be sure that they can follow a realistic policy that may guarantee that they have something to put on that picture. And I think that as long as the Cuban government is not falling, as long as demonstrations were not leading us to a situation of revolution, as long as a revolution didn't happen, a more realistic view may facilitate that, like in the past, those secret diplomacy connections may develop some kind of channels. And that could give the opportunity to Bill LeoGrande and Peter Kornbluth to write the final chapter or a last chapter to the book. This is my view.
Thank you. And I'd encourage people to read all the 2 essays already up and the third when it's finished. Before turning to Rita, let me just give my final thoughts. In Cuba, people were joking, talking about November 15th being Biden's Bay of Pigs. That is, that he was, like John Kennedy, he followed a strategy by momentum that was set in place by his predecessor. And he was misled by the experts around him, including in the National Security Council, maybe some in the State Department, who led him to believe that just hold tight, you're going to be the historic person who frees Cuba. That was wrong, just as it was wrong for John Kennedy. Cuba's freedom is Cuba's problem, not our problem. But there are a lot of people that got hurt by that illusion. I agree with Ed that the statistics aren't reliable, but there are at least several hundred people who were detained in July and maybe some later who are still in prison. And they're the analogy to the soldiers, the invading forces that the US sponsored, the CIA sponsored, the Bay of Pigs. After the Bay of Pigs, there was negotiation between the governments. The US arranged for their freedom and made a substantial contribution in humanitarian aid to Cuba. I think the analogy could be now that the US takes at least moral responsibility. I mean, I don't know that everybody on the street was there. I don't think that people were on the street and breaking into stores and turning over police cars as happened in July. And, you know, those were certainly some of the people who were arrested. And there were people who were arrested for what we'd consider just the crime of doing public protest. So it's not a crime. I think a lot of those people were misled by the rhetoric that flows online from the Cuba democracy programs. That's $20 million a year at least, because there's probably a lot of it that we don't know about. And they were misled if they heard radio and TV Marti about what would happen. And I think there is in the Biden administration now an obligation to do something about their situation and negotiate seriously with the Cubans. And whether that the other side of an equation is going back to all of the Obama policy or going beyond the Obama policy, whether it's providing some humanitarian assistance as was done after the Bay of Pigs. I mean, that's for the diplomats to figure out, but I think politically and morally, they have that responsibility. And that's what I will say over the next couple of months. I mean, I don't think we wasted our time on Biden and Harris. And certainly if you watch the video that will play at the end again of Jill Biden's trip to Cuba, I think that we need to bring to the surface what they really believe about the future of US-Cuban relations. So with my hopelessly optimistic, always view, Rita, would you like to, and let me remind people that we will put this online and you'll get a notice of the YouTube link. I will put online the chat and the Q&A. We were up to about 117 top. We held over 100 until certainly close to the hour and a half line. Now we're down to 83. So my assumption is, among other things, Rita, these are the people with the practical questions that you can answer and that we can find other ways of answering. So Bill, Ed, Rafael, if you want to sign off, you're welcome to do so. And Rita, it's your show.
So I've done my best, kind of as everyone has been talking, to go through the questions that popped up in the Q&A and the chat and address kind of those concerns. One thing that kind of that stands out is the concern if tourism is actually something that we should be doing right now, and should we be bringing tourists to Cuba? And my my answer is yes, and it's so emphatically yes. All of my Cuban friends, my Cuban colleagues, my Cuban family, they want tourism back in Cuba. Yes, we know there's lines for food, and you know, obviously the economic situation here right now is not good, but it will not get better without the help of tourism, and specifically American tourism, because it does generate quite a lot of money. To Ed's point before, there is half the amount of foreign currency coming in over the last 2 years. So the most important thing we can do is bring tourism back to Cuba. Some of the concerns, a lot of people had concerns about the food issues. For food-wise, the paladars are fully stocked. The hotels, which we cannot use, are up and running and stocked. There is, you know, drinks to be had and fun to be had. Concerts are back up and running. I have a ton of friends who are involved in the entertainment industry here in Cuba, and they are so happy to be back working. So they want to have audiences here. They want foreigners coming in. So I wouldn't be concerned about the food situation. There were some questions about the casas. I know that it would be nice to pay in foreign currency where you can. So if you are coming on your own, or even with groups, maybe hold off from changing all of your money at once, and hold on to some of your foreign currency, because that would be greatly appreciated by you know, your drivers and your casa owners, if you can pay in euros or dollars or whatever you're traveling with. The airlines, so there is confusion over flights right now. Some people are saying that the Cuban government has approved the flights. Others are saying that the airlines have approved and they're waiting for in the next few weeks, there will be flights added. As I mentioned before, JetBlue did begin adding last week. I actually ended up booking a flight that was added. So they will be reappearing as you know, in the next couple of weeks. The pricing from the States does start to drop towards mid-January and really starts to normalize in February, and there is quite a bit more availability from February on. So if you're looking to plan, maybe start looking at February. Let me just look quickly. Regarding vaccination and testing prior to arrival, there is no testing prior to arrival at the moment. Vaccination, if you are fully vaccinated with a WHO approved vaccine and you have your card with you, that's all you will need to get into Cuba. And fully vaccinated means if you have 2 doses of Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, or one of J&J. Right now, there's no booster required according to the WHO standards. So no pre-arrival testing, but there will be randomized testing at the airport. So not everyone will be tested, but they will randomly select people to test, and they will be taking temperatures. On the way out, to go back to the States, you do need an antigen test. And that is, they actually have a booth at the airport. I would suggest getting there very early if you want to do a test at the airport, only because they only have one person at the moment carrying out the test. And it doesn't seem like they'll be adding more for the time being. If you are traveling back to the States and you need a test and you're not traveling in a group, you can also get them at a clinic in Siboney. So that can be done with an appointment, and you actually pay with an American credit card. Other than that, you can do it at the airport. It's $30, and payment can be made with an American credit card as well. If you are traveling with a group, the Havanator and the other Cuban travel organizations have arranged to have your groups pre-testing done at the place that you are staying. And that's on the way back to the United States. Again, US dollars are not officially accepted here, but they are unofficially accepted, and you can find people who will, gladly change USD for you. You can otherwise officially you can change any currency and use it here. Regarding the cards that are being issued by the Ministry of Tourism, the MLC cards. Unless you'll be buying in an MLC shop, you won't need that. And the only thing that I can really, unless you're planning on visiting family and whatnot, and maybe taking them to buy groceries at some of the MLC shops, you won't really need that card, other than when buying maybe cigars and rum. And those cards are being sold in $200 amounts, $500 amounts, and $1,000 amounts. And when I say dollar, I mean MLC. And again, for a tourism purpose, you would only need those for maybe buying cigars or buying kind of souvenirs in the fancier shops. Those cards will not work at any of the private establishments. Right now, you can still, another question was about the hotels. You still cannot use hotels as an American citizen. It's not legal. Mexican pesos, you can travel with any currency. As I mentioned before, I'm just looking through the questions. Let me see. Boosters are not required. I think I mentioned that before. There was another question about remesas and Western Union, but those are still, you still cannot, there are no ways to send money with Western Union to Cuba from the US at the moment.
Rita, just let me add 2 small things. One is that if people are anxious to get to Cuba sooner, they should look at other routes. When I flew down, I went through Montreal to Varadero, and Cayman has announced that it's going to open its flights. You can fly through Jamaica, into Caribbean. Dominican Republic is reopening flights. And from Mexico, there are a variety of flights that are going to be happening. So don't just look at US carriers in the next month, especially when there's a lot of backlog, and US carriers are being outrageous in their pricing. I mean, they really are shameful in what they're doing. Rafael, I wondered whether your guess is that they will solve the problem of allowing official use of the dollar in the next month or so. I know there's some problems on the Cuban side of how they then use dollars internationally, but that is to be telling people they have to change money into euros or Canadians before they go takes us back 10 years. You're muted now. You got to unmute yourself this time. It's just the mute. There you go.
No, we cannot take this for granted as a policy that maybe last forever. I think that a few voices, authorized voices, are calling for restoring the legal use of dollars and to make direct deposits, particularly in USD accounts. And that could facilitate remittances in different ways. Even if the Biden administration keeps the restrictions and prohibition to deal with Cimex or whomever, there will be alternatives as long as it is possible to make a deposit directly using US dollars. So that is something I would expect, like may happen in 2022. In the first half of 2022, perhaps that policy is reconsidered.
Great. Hopefully that everything will move. Well, I want to, Rita, anything else that you saw?
Someone is asking about the US cards again. So the US cards are, I believe they're only accepted in medical situations, and that is why they are being accepted for the COVID test, but you can use US credit cards to pay for your COVID test to return to the US. That's the only place that I've seen them being accepted. Apart from, there are a few private restaurants that that will accept them, that maybe one of their owners has like a dual citizenship elsewhere, so they use a scanning Stripe or one of those systems to scan and take payments from US credit cards. So those are the only two instances where US credit cards are allowed. You still cannot bring back cigars and rum to the US. So I talked about paying for rum and cigars, but you can just have them here. You cannot bring them back. And that seems to be it.
Okay.
That seems.
Well, as I said, we will be posting the Q&A and the chat, and I'll send you the link for where those will be, at least, and check back on the page where we have the bios, because that's everything will be posted there, including Rafael's the link is there, and I'll put the third article up on that same link once we have it. Christopher Baker said there were 4 places you could get the tests. Part of the problem is that one of the most convenient place only does the PCR test, which requires a couple of days and is more expensive. So this will change moment to moment, and we'll see. That will surely evolve as the need evolves, as more Americans start coming and require that test to get back home. I'm sure the Cubans will find ways of providing them. Siboney is a long ways away, as people would testify. Anything finally, Bill, Rafael, Rita? Thank you all very much. People have asked if we're going to do this again. We will, sure, as people are available, and if Zoom would only push the US government to allow its service to be used, it would all be, I'm sure, part of the complications in this are the fact that it's got to go through VPNs. So thank you very much. Thanks to the audience who we can't have about 50% still with us, which as we go into the second hour is quite an accomplishment, I think. This will be online, and we will, if you're new to our list, by registering for this, you are condemned to receive mailings from me in the future. So I'm going to end it now. And there's some people who are prepared to say things. Let me see. Henry Yannis is asking. Let me see if I can quickly get him up because he's. I'm not finding him easily in the list, so I'll have to pass on that. So we will, if you're in the New York area, we're hoping there will be another version of the travel show announced soon, and we will see you there, hopefully. And we'll see you again online. And as soon as you can get to Cuba, you should go, because it will help people more than any other single thing you can do. So aside from convincing your congressman to sign the Dear Colleague letter, or congresswoman to sign the Dear Colleague letter. Okay, and that'll all be on the blog page. So thank you again very much, and especially despite Rafael dealing with his technical problems and Ed dealing with his, and you know, it's new standards of bars as sources for our communication. So I'll say goodbye for now.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, take care. Right. I just need to make sure that